neuroscience, quantum physics, biology, plant medicine, non-dual tantric meditative practices. We will be exploring these concepts with experts to provide insight. Get ready to melt reality with us. Dr. Anna Yusim is an internationally recognized, award-winning, board-certified Stanford and Yale educated mind, body, spirit, concierge psychiatrist and executive coach with a private practice in New York City, California, Connecticut, and Florida. She is the best-selling author of Fulfilled: How the Science of Spirituality Can Help You Live a Happier, More Meaningful Life. Anna has helped over 3,000 people achieve greater impact, purpose, and joy in their life and work, including Fortune 500 CEOs, Olympic athletes, A-list actors, actresses, the chair of academic departments at top universities, and more. After working as a neurobiology researcher with Dr. Robert Sapolsky and completing her studies at Stanford and Yale medical schools and the NYU psychiatric residency training program, Anna felt that something was missing from her life. And so in her quest to find it, she traveled and lived in over 70 countries while studying Kabbalah, learning Buddhist meditation, and working in South America with shamans and Indian gurus. Anna is currently creating a mental health and spiritual center at Yale University. Anna, welcome. It's just so nice to have you here. What a background. It's just, we're really excited to talk about this intersection of spirituality, science, and consciousness. And I just wondered, we always ask our guests just first off, what was it that inspired you as maybe an earliest memory or an early memory to explore the wonders of life, to become a doctor, and especially in the area of research that you do now?
Thank you so much, Jody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and David today. And so my education and experience was to be a bona fide psychiatrist, doctor, etc. Spirituality was not anywhere near my path. And then a number of things happened towards the end of my residency training. And when I think about it now, it was perfectly timed. When the formal part of my education was almost complete, a whole new education began, which was my spiritual education. And specifically what happened was strange and interesting things started to happen in my life. Separate from that, I was also going through some emotional trouble and turmoil, etc. And in the course of that, which I'm happy to expound on as well, strange and interesting things started happening, such as I was walking home from a lecture, and I went into an ice cream shop, and this woman comes up to me and says, "I'm a psychic and I have messages for you. Can I give you some messages?" She looked relatively innocuous, and I said, "Sure." And so she went and proceeded to tell me all of these things about my life that she had no way of knowing, that actually nobody had any way of knowing, that I'd never written anywhere. It was just things that were kind of in my consciousness or things that had happened. And I was like, what just happened here? And that moment there was this understanding that the world works a little bit differently than I'd always thought and that I'd been taught in medical school. We live in a slightly different world. Now I want to understand how the world really works, because I was taught that it works one way, basically that anything that can be seen and measured is reality and anything that can't is not. But what just happened in that moment was something that was so outside my conception of what is normal and real that I felt like I needed to really start to understand and study and figure out what happened there. And that's just the beginning. All sorts of things happened downstream of that. And that's ultimately what got me into the spiritual world, got me working on this mental health and spirituality center at Yale, got me writing my book about mental health and spirituality, and essentially has been my life course.
Wow. So do you believe that that experience was a true, was a true sort of otherworldly or supernatural experience that you had?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that there are people who receive information in all sorts of ways, and that we receive information in all sorts of ways. And there's, the way that I've received information my whole life has been highly rational. I study, I learn, I regurgitate, right? And then there's also emotional information. We feel, we have a response, a sensory, a visceral response to our environment. But then there's these other ways of receiving information, which are intuition. And there's certain people out there who are very deeply intuitive and can tap into all sorts of things. They can tap into you. They can tap into storehouses of information. They can tap into higher truth. They can tap into all sorts of things and get other forms of information. And I think that that's what was happening.
So I love that. All right. So you're creating the Mental Health and Spirituality Center at Yale. The idea that a university like Yale would connect these two worlds, mental health and spirituality, is somewhat unusual, I think, or people might not expect that would be the case. How did you convince a university like Yale to follow up on your vision and connect these two worlds?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So my book Fulfilled, which is about mental health and spirituality, came out in 2017. And at the time, I was not affiliated with any academic institution, very deliberately, because I was going through my spiritual transformation. I was studying Kabbalah. I was learning all these things about spiritual practices, beliefs, etc., trying to figure out where I land in that world. And I figured that actually being a part of an academic institution may limit that, or may make me feel that I have to think and be a certain way, as opposed to just how, and to write my book in a certain way. So I wrote my book completely independent of any academic institution. I finished my residency. I was in private practice at the time. My book showcases and documents the cases of 50 patients from my private practice over the first 7 years in practice. And after that, my fear was actually, okay, so I've actually written this book. Has a lot of spiritual material. It has a lot of personal disclosure and a lot of my personal experiences. I could really get discredited. I can get discredited by other psychiatrists, by my colleagues, by the profession. And so this was a big fear. Very, very luckily, a number of my colleagues actually really liked my book, wrote reviews of my book in top journals. The book was well received in the psychiatric community. And it was after that Yale invited me to come on their faculty as a product of having written this book. And I was thrilled. That was not an outcome I'd anticipated. That just kind of happened. And not only that, but when I went to present about my book at Yale, that's when Dr. Bob Rohrbach, who was associate chair of psychiatry at the time, and I started talking about the creation of this mental health and spirituality center. He encouraged me to do that. He thought it was a great idea. And that was in about 2018, a year after my book came out. So I went to knock on a few doors at Yale. Oh, we have this great idea. We're going to start the center. And it was so clear that was not the time. They're like, oh, okay, well, sure. So I put that idea on the back burner, saying, when the time is right, I'll know. And I continued on my spiritual path. And I was sitting in a meditation retreat of this meditation teacher, Joe Dispenza, and I hear this voice. This was 2 years ago. And the voice said, the time for your center is now. Go knock on the doors again. So I went to knock on the doors again. And this time the door swung wide open. The chair of psychiatry, Dr. John Crystal, said, this is a great idea. This is a very important idea. He called a meeting with some of the top psychiatrists, and they said, please support Anna in this endeavor. Dr. Christopher Pittenger, a high-ranking professor and endowed professor of psychiatry, came on board to co-found the center with me. And Dr. Pittenger, who's become a dear friend in the last 2 years, and I have been off to start this center. We got the chair of divinity and the divinity school on board, and are working right now to create the infrastructure and are seeking the funding. So this is how it happened. And it was about timing, and it was about surrender. And it was really about feeling that this has to come through us and is so much bigger than us.
What a journey. Very, very interesting. So I have a specific interest, personal interest in Kabbalah, but I found it very difficult to understand the core tenets. I'm trying to read a few books on it, and it's very, very difficult. We could spend the next 2 hours, I think, talking to you about Kabbalah, which we won't here, maybe some other time. But is there a resource or a book or something you can recommend to provide if any of our listeners like me are interested in understanding the core tenets of Kabbalah and giving a little bit more foundation?
Absolutely. So where I studied Kabbalah was the Kabbalah Center. It's a national, international organization. And what they do is I think they make Kabbalah very psychologically accessible to the common public, because you're exactly right. Kabbalah used to be something that could only be studied if number one, you were male. Number two, you were over 40 years old. Number three, you're a rabbi or have essentially committed your whole life to studying the Torah or, the Jewish law or the Christian law, because Kabbalah isn't just Jewish. There's also Christian Kabbalists, etc. So the Kabbalah was very, very exclusive. And what the founders of the Kabbalah Center believed is that this is very important esoteric knowledge. And it's the study of how energy works in this world. And they really sought to make it more accessible. And so the teachings at the Kabbalah Center, when I started, I have found them to be super, super accessible and not over my head. And what I would recommend for people is taking, for instance, a course, an intro to Kabbalah course with David Guillaume. He's one of my former teachers. And his, Kabbalah class, very accessible. He's an excellent teacher. 10 classes, enjoyable, fun, and super interesting.
So great. Thank you, Anna. I, like you, have had a deep exploration of comparative religions, of different practices. I traveled to Vietnam with Thich Nhat Hanh. I lived in Kashmir 8 times over 12 years with Swami Lakshmanju and have been a student of Kashmir Shaivism for many years. I was born again when I was in high school. All of these things to enable me to have a taste of a longing in me, right? A longing. So you've traveled to 70 countries and you've practiced Kabbalah and Buddhism and shamanic practices, and you've been with Indian teachers. And I wondered if there is something that you have taken from all of that cornucopia of experience into the work at Yale and into your own mystical journey, I would say.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like it's really, for me, an understanding of how the world works, because before I thought the world works in one way. And that was what I had mentioned before, that anything that is real can be seen and measured. And so one of the tenets of Kabbalah that I learned early on was that their belief is that that which can be seen and measured only comprises 1% of ultimate reality. 99% of reality is unseen and unheard. It's not something that you can tap into. It's other dimensions upon dimensions that can't be perceived in the way that we perceive most of that which we know to be true. And so what that did for me is it made the world much more expansive, vast, and mysterious, and therefore much more interesting. And to me, it also then opened up this idea of energy and of how energy flows in this world, and of how we have control over the flow of energy through our emotions, through our thoughts, through our behaviors, and that we have a lot of impact on what happens in our life through our will. And our will is just part of, what happens, because there's also a divine will or a collective will. And so we're ultimately constantly co-creating our will with the divine will. And if we're able to be able to toggle between willfully and deliberately acting to make things happen and surrendering to the will of the divine, life turns out beautifully. If you're resistant in either one of those and have trouble with either, there's challenges. There's going to be challenges no matter what. Life is just like that. But the way to overcome them is this co-creative process in between your will and a surrender process.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Like, in the science of consciousness, of course, quantum physicists are describing reality as made up of consciousness. And so when you use a word like divine, of course, some people will not understand, not have a connection to divine. They may describe it as different words like higher energy, consciousness, intuition. What I love about your book, and I would love for you to talk about your book and this work, but what I love about it is that and you could see it in religious institutions with prayer, when we get out of the mind, intellect, and ego into the heart of worship, the intellect calms down and we are connected to something greater than ourselves. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the word divine, but also from a scientific perspective, sort of what happens to a person when they're immersed in that worship.
That's really beautiful. Absolutely. I love that. And I love the way that you are describing it, because I feel like our connection to the divine happens precisely when all the other voices and influences in our mind and in our life and in our heart temporarily calm, And it's that still quiet voice, which is the voice of the soul, the voice of the divine, the voice of intuition, whatever you ultimately want to call it. And that voice will guide you. And, there's a lot of very wise people that say that perfect intuition will guide you perfectly. And so you need to be able to connect to that intuition and be able to clear out the noise. And what happens scientifically, essentially, there's different regions of the brain that are responsible for different faculties. And there's certainly regions of the brain responsible for prayer and for belief. There's a lot of studies, by the way, showing that having spiritual beliefs and practices enhance physical well-being, reduce hospitalization, increase your well-being with a cancer diagnosis, no matter how serious the cancer is, increase your likelihood of a remission from alcoholism. And actually, the number one factor that increases remission from alcoholism is having had a spiritual awakening. And even though beliefs and spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs are important, it's the practices that are associated with the beliefs that actually are more important for sustained well-being, both from a mental health as well as a physical health standpoint. So this is a little bit of the science of spirituality and how the science impacts our daily life, our health, and our well-being.
All right. So I'm a neuroscientist, Anna, and I'm dying to ask you. We have begun to study, the royal we of scientists, have begun to study how the brain responds to hallucinogens. We use, fMRI techniques, PET scanning. We're also understanding that the brain itself produces chemicals like DMT, sometimes called the spirit molecule. Can you talk to us a little bit about our understanding of what happens to the brain during these divine experiences that you're describing? What areas of the brain do we think are pulled into this? What do we know from a scientific perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to talk to you a little bit about psychedelics, because I feel like psychedelics and DMT, which is an important thing that many psychedelics will create or will, up level in your brain, is something that has been responsible for many people's spiritual awakenings, for many people's psychedelic positive experiences, and also possibly for psychotic experiences as well. And so let's talk a little bit about psychedelics, what brain regions, what neurotransmitters are affected. So let's first talk about the legal psychedelic, and that is ketamine. That is the only one that presently is legal in our country. Hopefully down the road, we're going to have MDMA, which could be legal within the year. And then we can also have psilocybin, which is legal also in some states, but not yet in the state that I'm in, New York City, but down the road will be. And then there is many others. There's peyote, there's ayahuasca, there's LSD, etc. So what do these substances do? For me, the most interesting thing is not only do these substances offer a fully novel neurobiological mechanism for treating some of the most treatment refractory mental illnesses, such as depression, PTSD, anxiety, alcoholism, OCD, etc. But they also offer, for many people, a very powerful connection to spirit. And that means different things to different people. So that is a subjective, self-transcendent, sometimes mystical experience that can present as you seeing your life and the narrative of your life from a completely different perspective, which shifts you and your perception of your life and creates this whole new vantage point from which to understand your life. That's number one. Number two, it could also create sensory and hallucinatory experiences, as you mentioned, and that could be visual, auditory, somatic sensations that could be very powerful. It could connect you to other spirits in other realms. People have seen loved ones who have passed. People have seen angels come in during these experiences. People have had psychic surgeries where afterwards their bodies actually physically changed by something that they perceived on a psychic, spiritual level, but that actually had a profound physical consequence. Now, these are just a few of the things that psychedelics can do. There's so much more. Now, does this happen to every person? No. Does it happen to people? Absolutely. Can it also happen in a way that could be very difficult? Sometimes people can, in the course of a psychedelic experience, overshoot the mark. They can have a scary journey, a scary trip. they, for whatever reason, a certain substance could not sit well with them, with their neurochemistry. They can have a psychotic experience that won't go away. And people have had persistent psychosis from it. This is one of the issues with this. People can be seeking a spiritual awakening, but overshoot the mark and then become psychotic. And unfortunately, our mental and physical healthcare system isn't set up for that. And so a person can then be diagnosed with schizophrenia, treated or put on medications for many, many years, whereas they could actually be, treated in other ways, and it could be understood from a completely different vantage point. And a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Daniel Ingram, is creating the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium to address this problem and to help. He's a former emergency room physician, now retired, but to help emergency room physicians to reorient. So this is a little bit of what, and I'm talking more from a clinical standpoint than neurobiological. I hope that's okay. That's a little bit more my world.
It's perfect. And thanks for scratching that itch. Are you familiar with Rick Strassman's work, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy?
A little bit. I would love for you to tell me some more.
Yeah, well, maybe we can talk a little offline about that, but he's got some fascinating work on the role of DMT in biblical prophecy in the Hebrew Bible. So it's a very interesting theory.
Amazing. And this is also Brian Moore-Rescue. He's written about psilocybin, in Christianity and also as a sacrament that was used by so many to be able to open those channels. People have been seeking connection to the divine for decades. This is certainly not something that is unique to us or that is our idea. We're actually taking it from the indigenous, which is why it's so important to culturally appropriate and to understand the brilliance from which this derives and to be able to figure out the right way in which to integrate it into our own culture if it is a plant medicine that's, and really have respect for the indigenous people who bring it to bear.
So I there's ketamine clinics that are already available to people. And I know, of course, MAPS is doing stage 3 clinical studies on MDMA. I wasn't aware of the extent that you just described about the risk of psychotic episodes. And I wondered if that's with any particular type of plant, or is it across the spectrum of plants? It's a very interesting question. But you have college students doing microdosing, and we have a test now that people on our website can order that will enable them to understand the dosage of what they're taking so that they don't overdose, which is a beautiful thing. It's called Miralax. And but can you talk about the risk and if there's certain plants that have more of a risk to that, so that listeners can understand a little bit about this?
Definitely. So the way that you can think about this is that when people are going into this realm of whether it be DMT or this realm of high glutamate or like this kind of open, spiritual, mystical, self-transcendent, subjectively powerful experience, you're all becoming a little psychotic, right? You're getting a new way of seeing and being in the world. And for the majority of us, we have that. That changes how we see the world, then we come back to ourselves. However, there are people that based on their genetics and their history have more of a propensity for that going into that space to be a little dangerous. And so for clinical trials with ketamine, for individuals, who use ayahuasca, for psilocybin, for the clinical trials, if you yourself have ever been psychotic, if you have a first-degree relative who's been psychotic, and psychotic could also includes the possibility of severely bipolar, because sometimes bipolarity has psychotic features, or in some trials, it's even a second-degree relative. If there's anybody close to you who has been psychotic, you're not a good candidate because the likelihood of you having an untoward consequence is high, or higher than somebody who doesn't have that, right? And so it's an imperfect system because number one, there's plenty of people who might have undiagnosed this, and then they will be in the trial and then they'll have a psychotic episode. I've certainly seen people like that, and they've come to me and found me saying, I had no idea I had this risk factor, and now what do I do? How do I get myself back? That's number one. And number two, there's also people who are super, super conscientious and really want that access to spirit because these substances provide something really profound and potent that they may not know how to get in other ways. And they're like, no one's letting you do this. Like they're saying no to me because my father was schizophrenic, but I'm not schizophrenic. And I've been a spiritual seeker my whole life. And I really feel that this can open that for me. Will you work with me, doctor, to come up with a safe protocol to do this? So this is like this whole other thing. So I have people from both sides that I've been treating. And so it's so important to be able to evaluate each case individually on a case-by-case basis and to help people with what they really need for their growth process.
So beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I had the privilege of doing ayahuasca in the jungle with Lynn Twist and Pachamama Alliance. And at some point, I was fundamentally expanded outside of my ego. And it was extraordinary. And I do have in my family a sibling that suffered with schizophrenia. So but fortunately, I had no problem. And I've been fascinated by the mind and chemistry because of that sibling, because watching him be such a different person chemically. And then my own journey, I'm a yogi and a mystic and I'm a meditator. I don't have a ongoing desire to do psychedelics, but I did in the jungle with Lynn, and it was the most transformative thing. It just was an exquisite experience. And so I wanted to talk to you about the ego and the dissolution of the ego. And, we're always seeking to reunite with this quality of union. We live in a subject-object experience, and we're always feeling separate. And the ego always is I and other. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as a psychiatrist and a mystic yourself, a spiritual journeyer yourself, what you can say to our listeners about the ego and this longing for union and this feeling of separateness.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. And I feel like ultimately all of us are longing for connection with ourselves, with each other, with the divine. And we seek that connection in so many different ways. And the ego is just, as you said, that often which separates us and keeps us from seeing the interconnectedness and our common humanity, which is what separates us. And it leads us to judge. And, in Kabbalah, they would say that there's all of these manifestations of ego: anger, hatred, pride, jealousy, the need for control, all of that. And then there is manifestations of soul consciousness as opposed to ego consciousness. And that's love and perseverance, non-judgmentalness, tolerance, love. Being able to toggle between those, recognizing that as humans, we all have an ego and that we can make choices to observe, recognize, love our ego, but actually align more with our soul and to live our life in that way. And that is what enables us to overcome that separation. And for different people, it's different levels of difficulty. For some people, they're just loving, kind people, no problem. For other people, it's the greatest thing in the world to overcome that. And when they're able to, amazing things open up. And in Kabbalah, basically, since everything is about the movement of energy, if you want to overcome something great in your life, the way to do it, to overcome something great outside of you, is to look for the antecedent of it within you and overcome that. And as you overcome that, the thing outside of you miraculously shifts. So this is, I think, a beautiful way to think about some of our world's biggest problems, and recognizing that not only can we make a difference in the world through advocacy and changing the outside world, but that everything outside of us is a metaphor for what's inside, and to always look within us and be able to change as well.
Beautiful.
Yeah, really, really beautiful. So that's, I think, a good segue I wanted to ask you about the divisiveness in the world. I don't think it takes a great deal of insight to recognize that there's a great deal of divisiveness in the world. We've got, religious and political conflicts raging. We've got human trafficking and exploitation of vulnerable populations, all over the world. What do you want to say about how sort of a new quote unquote spirituality could help to address this divisiveness and exploitation that we see? Do you feel like is there any hope for us, Anna?
Yeah, I mean, there has to be. We have to have hope. We have no choice, right? And it's so sad. You're exactly right that the divisiveness exists on every level: socio-political, cultural, at the level of gender, of race, between countries, between individuals, between brothers and sisters, over crazy things like vaccines, all sorts of things. This is just, things like we're all trying to be loving and enhance the vibrational frequency of our world. In the process, we think that we know the right way. And so with this, I think this is precisely what I'm talking about looking for the antecedent of the divisiveness within us. How are we divided in ourselves? What are the disavowed parts of ourselves that we don't own, the parts of ourselves that we think, are unacceptable? We see something unacceptable out there. Oh, this person believes this. I don't want to have anything to do with them. This is garbage. Oh, they voted for Trump. Oh my God, like stay away, or they didn't vote for Trump, stay away, whatever that is, right? And so what parts of ourselves have we disavowed? And in what ways are we ourselves not fully integrated? This is really owning your shadow, right? And your shadow side is the part of yourself that somehow early on you were taught was unlovable or not okay. And so you disavow it. And you're like, well, I need to be a good girl because that's what my mommy wanted when I was 5. And so mommy doesn't like it when I'm angry. So I'm just not going to be angry. And moreover, whenever I feel anger, I'm just going to put it over there in that corner and just not even let myself feel it at the conscious level. So you disavow anger, which is what many women do. And for men, they can disavow their dependency needs. It's not okay to depend on anybody as a man. You need to be macho and strong. God forbid I actually need this woman or this other man. God forbid. So I am strong and macho. And so what happens then? Then we go on and we project the parts of ourselves that we disavow onto other people. And so for me, if I disavow my anger, when another person is angry at me or around me, I cannot stand that person. I'm so reactive to that person. Oh my God, get away from me. And what happens to a man when he disavows his dependency needs in another person? So he's in a relationship, right? Say with a woman. And then that woman has dependency needs and starts to need things from him. Oh my God, I hate it when women are so needy. I can't stand that. Get away from me. Oh my God. And so relationships never work. But at the end of the day, it's his own disavowal of his own neediness or dependency needs. And it's my own disavowal of my own anger. So if we can integrate ourselves and become more whole, if we can bring into ourselves the parts of ourselves that we may deem unlovable, I think that at the individual level is actually the personal formula for dealing with external divisiveness.
That's wonderful. What a great direct answer. That's a wonderful answer. So Anna, before we end this interview, I have got to ask you about your work with your mentor, Robert Sapolsky. So he's been all over the news with his book, Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will. So can you give us your perspective on Dr. Sapolsky's theory that there is no free will in the universe?
I love Dr. Sapolsky. I think he's brilliant. I think he's amazing. It was incredible to work with him at Stanford. And actually, his book Behave and my book Fulfilled came out within the same month. And so I was able to meet him during a book event at the Y. And we took, pictures of our books together. And that was so special and so beautiful. And that just made me really happy. And he's continued to do incredible work. His idea basically that every single thing that happens is a function of things that happened before it, all the way down to the microscopic, the cellular, the biological, the genetic level. Absolutely. Yes, that is very, very true. And that there's all of these things that have led up to me being here at this very moment and making the decisions that I've made in order to be here with you and saying exactly what I'm saying to you. Right. And so I agree with his theory. There is so much that predetermines who we are and what we are going to do that really is not based at all on my free will. I actually wrote my Stanford honors thesis also about a very, very similar topic. Now, in the moment right now, all of that ceases to be. And I believe that I have complete free will over what I say, whether I'm here with you, whether I'm here with another person, whether I blink, whether I put my hands up. And so determined is right in the biggest sense. And yet in the moment, we all have to live as though we have free will. There's no other way to live.
Wow.
Yeah, that's great. I know there's a famous rabbi, Dr. Joseph Soloveitchik, who says our job as human beings is to turn fate into destiny. And I think that's a really lovely way of saying it, because fate is sort of the no free will side of the equation, and destiny has that element of we do have control at some level.
I love that. And I'm actually going to be speaking with a rabbi who is, I'm the chief medical officer for a company that is run by a rabbi and his colleague. And I'm going to be speaking with him later today. I love that quote. And I'm sure I'm going to quote you in quoting Rabbi's information to him. So thank you.
I was going to ask you what you recommend to our listeners to sort of help navigate their own inner journey. And I think you really framed a beautiful practice, which is whatever pushes our buttons basically externally to go internally and see what in our own journey ourself is coming up for us about that reaction. I think that's extraordinary. And would our listeners be able to learn more about that process in your book, or is there a way that they can dive deeper into that practice?
Definitely. That is chapter 4 of my book. It's on the shadow side. So absolutely. And I would certainly recommend that. My book is full of exercises. It's really about theory and practice, because although theory is important, and bibliotherapy, a way of getting your therapy through books and reading, is super, super important and has been a huge part of my journey. You also need practices. So I've tried to put in a lot of exercises to enable people to go through and do things that really push the envelope in their own lives. And I think also for everybody to look and try on and try out a few different practices until they find what works for them, at least for the moment, and to always have a practice that they are turning to. And if they're a sampler like me, they might have it for a week, a month, a year, and then go on to the next thing. And Kabbalah, that stayed in my life for 12 years before I went on to the next thing. And then parts of it stay with you forever, of course. But really to have some spiritual practice that you're doing that is helping you to move forward.
Wonderful, wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to share about what's next for you, like in your work, in your journey? Is there any?
Sure. Yes, I am working on my second book right now. So my first book was on the science of spirituality. My next book is on actually the science of miracles, with a miracle being defined as something highly beneficial yet statistically improbable. And the question for the book is, what can we as human beings do to increase the likelihood and frequency of miracle in our life?
Wow, that's beautiful. Oh my gosh. I think in every culture, in every religious background, there are multiple mystical experiences by humans in all walks of life, all ages. And I love this time in our culture where we're sharing more about our experiences. And I think the opening up of the ayahuasca and plant medicine to this conversation of experience and miracles and mystery is so healing and helpful for our society. So, thank you so much for this conversation, Anna, this time. And it's just been an honor and a pleasure to be with you. And I learned from your book, and I hope our listeners will dive into it. In our show notes, we'll have access to how to get the book and all the other experts that we've listed and mentioned on the show. And, again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you both.
Miraculous is a small and independent company that has created the first quantifiable home test called Q-test for anyone taking mushrooms or psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and any other psychoactive substance. So think about this. You're at home, you're with friends, you're hanging out, and you're experimenting with these amazing psychoactive plant medicines, and yet you don't really know the dosage. Miraculous is here to help you really have a positive experience so that you don't overdose. Created by Dr. Felix Bell of Germany, Please go on our show notes and order this package. They're now available in the USA, and we couldn't be more excited to represent this home kit because we want you to have a truly positive experience with psychoactives to explore your own reality and the way these psychoactives can help you in your life.
Exploring Reality Maybe is written, produced, fact-checked, and edited by Jody R. Weiss and David Schwartz. Research support is provided by Semicolon Connects. Music produced by Nextbox. Visit our website at exploringrealitymaybe.org to find show notes, transcripts, bios, and to learn more. If you like the show, please visit our website to donate.